My name is Cleveland Johnson. I'm director of the National Music Museum.
And how many years have you been working here?
I'm finishing my third full year here. This is a harpsichord, a Portuguese harpsichord by the builder Jose Callisto. We know practically nothing about him. It's the only instrument attributed to him, but we do have his name very visible on the instrument that we can see. The instrument's dated from 1780 and is only one of maybe a half a dozen harpsichords from Portugal from this time period. As far as this instrument in the context of harpsichord building in the 18th century, this is a fairly conservative instrument. By 1780, in countries like England or France, you'd find harpsichord builders kind of on the bleeding edge of the technology, trying new things, out there competing with the newfangled gadget of the age, the forte piano. But this Portuguese example is a fairly conservative, very traditional design. So it's quite likely that it's not unlike at all the kinds of instruments that Bach would have known. Bach, of course, died a good 30 years before this harpsichord was built. Because it's a fairly conservative design, it takes us back into that harpsichord style that Bach himself would have known in Germany. If you were in Paris in 1780 or in Vienna in 1780, the harpsichord would already be in its final decline, and the forte piano would be in the middle of its ascendancy, ultimately supplanting the harpsichord almost completely by the turn of the century. As I said, this instrument's a very conservative model, and it suggests that for whomever it was built or for whatever context or situation, whether it was for a middle-class family or for a minor aristocrat, there's nothing really adventurous or experimental going on here. It's good bread and butter harpsichord building. All European countries at this time, as well as for many centuries earlier, were in some way connected through royalty, through marriages, through alliances, and that would carry through in culture as well, so that you would see a great deal of international commerce going on among musicians. Certainly we know that Italian musicians were active in Germany, that Spanish musicians were active in Italy, and you would find this kind of internationalism among the artists. And I think that goes as well for the instrument builders, so that someone building a harpsichord in Portugal would have been very knowledgeable of what was happening elsewhere on the continent and vice versa. At the time that Bach was writing his concertos, concertos which were designated for keyboard, the term keyboard meant basically any instrument that had a keyboard. So one can make an argument that retrospectively we're justified to use any number of instruments depending on what's available, depending on what our taste or our sound aesthetic might be. In Bach's day and in his immediate context, he most likely performed these on a harpsichord. But in Germany, even in provincial Germany where Bach spent most of his career, he may well have had a German harpsichord at his disposal in one palace, or in one church he may have had an Italian harpsichord at his disposal in another setting, or at the coffee house that we know he composed for. It could have been a French harpsichord. As I said earlier, the internationalism among instrument builders and among the commerce of music meant that any number of harpsichords or keyboards could have been used for this music. This happens to be a very appropriate instrument for the Bach concerto. It has two sets of strings on it for some variety. It is very similar to the Italian construction that Bach most definitely knew, and it projects well. It's in very good playing condition, and it's an excellent reflection, I think, of the sound that you need for this performance. One of the first things that you notice about this particular instrument is how long it is. It is, in fact, just a mere 6 inches or so shorter than a modern Steinway Grand. So if the audience could be up on stage and actually see it up close and personal, you'd notice that it's a very, very long instrument. The reason for that is because the builder was using or adhering very closely to string lengths based on Pythagorean principles, good old Pythagoras of the Pythagorean theorem. Much of the math that he was doing in ancient Greece, much of the math that he was doing in ancient Greece had to do with sound, had to do with music. And he determined that if you took a string of a particular length, and if you doubled the length of that string, you would have a pitch 1 octave below it. So the scale of the strings on this instrument is basically that 2-to-1 proportion, so that G at the very top is maybe much of the math that he was doing in ancient Greece had to do with sound, had to do with music. And he determined that if you took a string of a particular length, and if you doubled the length of that string, you would have a pitch 1 octave below it. So the scale of the strings on this instrument is basically that 2-to-1 proportion, so that G at the very top is maybe 4 inches long, and the next G down is 8 inches long. And if you maintain that proportion all the way through the entire compass of the instrument, when you get down to the low G, you end up really with a very long string. So that accounts for the extreme length of this particular instrument because of that Pythagorean principle that was being employed. This particular instrument has 2 sets of strings, so the performer can choose to use either one set of strings alone or to use both sets of strings together. That doesn't mean that suddenly the instrument gets twice as loud. If you just use your own imagination, anyone knows that having 2 sopranos doesn't necessarily mean that it's twice as loud as having 1 soprano, or having 2 trumpets. It's not going to be twice as loud as 1 trumpet. But it does give a fullness to the sound. It does allow some slight dynamic enhancement to the sound that otherwise is fairly limited on the harpsichord. The range of this specific instrument is 5 octaves, which is larger than you would have found a century earlier. One of the things about keyboard instruments as they change over time, among the various modifications and developments, is the size of the keyboard. So a century and a half earlier, you may have only found 4 octaves. Over time, they're gradually growing to 5, and eventually they will continue to grow to what we know today. Something else that you'll notice on the harpsichord is that these two sets of strings are plucked at slightly different positions, so they have a slightly different timbre, and they sound at slightly different moments in the striking of the key. So that if you push the key down very slowly, you'll hear 1 string pluck before the 2nd string plucks. And this just brings a little life to the sound, a little further resonance as well to what's otherwise a fairly static sound, something that the harpsichord had to struggle with as the new forte piano was out there bringing on this novel ability to gradually change between soft and loud. The basic difference between a harpsichord and a piano is that the strings are plucked on a harpsichord as opposed to struck. Yeah. The piano has a fairly complex mechanism that transfers the motion of the performer's finger through the key lever and up through a hammer mechanism to strike the string. The harpsichord has a much simpler mechanism that allows that motion to go up through a jack, we call it, with a little piece of crow quill, a plectrum, much like a guitar pick, if you will, that passes by the string, and in passing it plucks that string. So it's a plucked sound as opposed to a struck sound. One reason that we chose this particular harpsichord to share with you, beside the fact that it will sound lovely at the Bach, is that it's very robustly built. And it needed to be robust because to be used with the orchestra tonight, we need to get it up to modern pitch. Typically, this harpsichord would sound a good half pitch lower than you're going to hear it tonight. But because it's such a sturdy thing, we were able to get it up to A440, just as a kind gesture to all the musicians on stage who would otherwise have to tune down to it. So you'll be hearing it up at modern pitch tonight. One of the great things about old instruments is that there was so much attention paid to the way they looked, and it's always a feast for the eyes for us today. Although this particular harpsichord is fairly plain and simple, it still has some visual components that I think will be striking and appealing. For example, the keyboard itself, you'll notice that it has beautiful, warm boxwood naturals and ebony sharps. The veneer around the inside of the harpsichord is an absolutely gorgeous Brazilian tulip wood. You ask why tulip wood? Because in the 18th century, Brazil was a Portuguese colony. And this is not to be confused with American tulip wood, which is a kind of poplar. This is a version almost of rosewood. I think it's a subspecies of rosewood. So it's a beautiful, rich colors of red, orange, even pink, and a beautiful veneer here that you can see. Externally, the appearance otherwise is very plain and simple, almost as if it were a peasant instrument. The harpsichord in a royal court would have been very lavishly decorated by some of the finest painters of the time. The soundboard would have been painted, the lid would have been painted, the stand would have been painted. But this is a very utilitarian, very sturdy, robust instrument.